There is a room in your mind you have never entered. You pass by its door every day, sometimes multiple times, and each time you feel something, a tremor, a whisper, a cold draft that makes you quicken your pace. You do not know what lies behind that door. You have taught yourself not to know. And yet, in the silence of 3 a.m., when sleep abandons you and your heart races with a nameless dread, you feel the weight of that unopened room pressing against your chest like a stone. This is not metaphor. This is the lived architecture of the human psyche. Welcome, traveler of the inner world, to a descent into one of the mind's most elegant and terrible mechanisms, the phenomenon we call repression. You have joined us in Season 3 of our journey, the descent into shadow, where we meet the parts of ourselves we have exiled into darkness. Tonight, we explore the question that has haunted psychology since its inception, the riddle that drives millions into therapist offices, into midnight panic attacks, into the slow dissolution of their emotional lives. How does the act of burying what we cannot face create the very chaos we are trying to escape? Listen carefully. What you are about to discover is not comfortable. It will not offer you easy solutions or 5 steps to happiness, but it will show you something far more valuable. It will reveal the invisible machinery that has been running your life from beneath the floorboards of consciousness. It will explain why anxiety arrives like an uninvited guest at precisely the moments you thought you were safe, why emotional chaos erupts from nowhere like a volcano beneath a quiet field, why the harder you try to hold yourself together, the more violently you seem to fall apart. The human mind is not a simple thing. It is not a machine that breaks down cleanly, with visible parts and obvious malfunctions. It is more like an ocean, vast, layered, with currents that move in opposing directions, with depths that sunlight never reaches, with creatures that have evolved in darkness so complete they have lost their eyes. And in those depths, in the trenches of the unconscious mind, dwell the things we have refused to acknowledge, the feelings we could not afford to feel, the truths we could not bear to speak, the memories that, if remembered, would shatter the fragile stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Repression is what happens when the mind looks at something and says, "This cannot be. This will destroy me. This must be erased." But here is what Freud understood, what Jung elaborated, what modern neuroscience confirms with brain scans and chemistry. Nothing is ever truly erased. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. And what we repress does not disappear. It descends. It goes underground. It learns to speak in a different language. It speaks in anxiety, in panic attacks that strike without warning, in relationship patterns that repeat with eerie precision, in addictions we cannot explain, in a general sense of unease that colors everything, like smoke from a fire we cannot locate, in emotional explosions that seem disproportionate to their triggers, because the trigger is not really the cause, it is merely the key that unlocks a door to something much older, much deeper, much more frightening. Imagine, if you will, a civilization that decided to handle its waste by simply burying it, not in landfills, not in treatment centers, but just beneath the streets, beneath the houses, stuffed into the foundation of every building. For a while this works. Life goes on. People walk above the buried waste, unaware. But over time, the buried material begins to ferment. It creates pressure. It seeps into the groundwater. It produces toxic gases that rise through cracks in the floors. Eventually, the entire city becomes sick, and no one can understand why. The doctors treat symptoms, respiratory problems, skin conditions, mysterious illnesses, but no one thinks to look beneath the ground. This is what repression does to the human psyche. We are not taught this as children. No one pulls us aside at age 7 and says, "Listen carefully. Every feeling you refuse to feel, every truth you refuse to see, every part of yourself you reject, these things will not vanish. They will form a second self, a shadow self, that will grow in power proportional to your denial of it. And one day, when you least expect it, when you have finally built a life you think is safe, this shadow will surface, and it will feel like madness. But this is the reality. This is the mechanism that therapists spend decades helping people understand. This is why you can achieve everything you thought you wanted, the career, the relationship, the perfect life, and still feel hollow, anxious, on the verge of collapse. Because you have built your castle on a foundation of unprocessed pain, and foundations always reveal themselves. Tonight we are going to trace this mechanism from its origins to its consequences. We will walk through the history of how humanity discovered the unconscious mind. We will descend into the psychological underworld where repressed content lives and breeds. We will see how anxiety is not a malfunction, but a message, a desperate signal from the parts of ourselves we have abandoned, trying to get our attention the only way they know how. And by the end of this journey, you will understand something profound. That the path to peace is not through more repression, more control, more disciplined denial. It is through the terrifying and liberating act of turning toward the door you have spent a lifetime avoiding, opening it, and meeting what lives inside. The descent begins now. But before we enter the depths, we must understand where this journey began. We must go back to the moment when humanity first realized that consciousness was not the whole story. That beneath the rational mind, beneath the ego's careful constructions, there churned an entire realm of mental life that operated according to different laws, that contained different contents, that wielded extraordinary power over our daily existence. We must go back to the late 19th century, to Vienna, to a young neurologist who would stumble upon a discovery so disturbing that even he would spend the rest of his life trying to fully comprehend its implications. Are you ready to descend? Then let us begin with the question that started everything. What if the mind you think you know is only the tip of an iceberg, and everything that truly matters, all the forces that shape your emotions, your choices, your entire emotional life, exists in the 9/10 you cannot see? Vienna, 1886. The city glittered with the last gasps of empire. Gaslight reflected off rain-slicked cobblestones. In fashionable drawing rooms, men in tailcoats discussed progress, reason, the triumph of science over superstition. The Enlightenment had done its work. Humanity had been liberated from the darkness of ignorance. The mind was rational, transparent to itself, governed by will and consciousness. Or so they thought. In a modest medical office, a young doctor named Sigmund Freud was encountering something that didn't fit the prevailing theories. His patients, mostly women from respectable families, were suffering from mysterious symptoms. Paralysis with no neurological cause, blindness that vanished under hypnosis, physical pain that migrated around the body like a phantom, anxiety attacks that struck without reason. The medical establishment called it hysteria and blamed it on a wandering womb, a diagnosis that had persisted since ancient Greece. But Freud suspected something else. When he listened to these women speak, when he followed the threads of their stories, he began to notice a pattern. The symptoms always seemed connected to memories, experiences, thoughts that the patients could not or would not consciously acknowledge. One of his earliest patients, history knows her as Anna O., suffered from paralysis and speech difficulties. Under hypnosis, she began to speak of traumatic experiences she had completely forgotten in her waking state. And when these buried memories surfaced and were discussed, her symptoms often disappeared. This was the crack in reality, the moment when Freud realized that the mind was not one thing, but many things, that consciousness was only the surface, that beneath it churned an entire realm of mental content that was not simply forgotten, but actively held out of awareness, not due to time or poor memory, but due to a force he would come to call repression. What Freud had discovered was not merely that people forget traumatic events. Forgetting is passive, natural, the slow erosion of memory over time. What he observed was something active, a dynamic process by which the mind itself worked to keep certain contents from entering consciousness. The mind was censoring itself, building walls inside itself, creating what he would later call the unconscious, not as a place where random, forgotten things accumulated, but as a realm where specific materials were imprisoned, materials that posed a threat to the ego's stability. Think about this for a moment. Freud was suggesting that you, the you that experiences yourself as a unified, conscious self, are not the whole of your mind, that there is another part of your mind, just as real, just as active, containing thoughts, desires, memories, impulses that you cannot access, and that this hidden part of your mind influences your behavior, your emotions, your entire psychological life, without your awareness or consent. It was as if he had discovered that every human being is inhabited, that we are not alone in our own heads, that we are, in a very real sense, haunted by ourselves. This idea, which seems almost commonplace now, after more than a century of psychology and therapy culture, was revolutionary. It suggested that the Enlightenment project of reason and self-knowledge had missed something fundamental, that we are not transparent to ourselves, that self-deception is not an occasional failing, but a core feature of mental life, that the rational ego is more like a rider on a horse than the master of a machine, and the horse has its own agenda, its own knowledge, its own direction. But Freud's initial discovery was just the beginning. The question that would consume him, and psychology, for decades to come was, why does repression happen? What purpose does it serve? And what are the consequences of this internal exile? Let us trace the mechanism, step by step. Imagine a child, perhaps you, decades ago. This child lives in a family, and like all families, this one has its own emotional climate, its own spoken and unspoken rules. Perhaps it is a family where anger is forbidden, where showing vulnerability is seen as weakness, where the message, delivered 1,000 times in 1,000 subtle ways, is, control yourself. Be good. Don't make trouble. Now imagine this child feels something that violates the rules, a surge of rage at a parent, a desire for something shameful, a terror that seems too big to name. The child learns quickly that expressing these feelings brings rejection, punishment, disapproval. The child's survival, both physical and emotional, depends on maintaining the attachment to the parents. And so the child makes an unconscious calculation: I cannot afford to feel this. It is too dangerous. It threatens everything. And so the feeling is split off from consciousness, not through any deliberate decision. The child is too young for that, but through an automatic process that Freud called repression. The feeling doesn't disappear. It descends into the unconscious, and there it remains, frozen in time, unprocessed, waiting. Freud believed that repression was primarily about sexual and aggressive impulses, the drives that civilization demands we control. Jung would later expand this, arguing that we repress not just forbidden desires, but any aspect of ourselves that doesn't fit our ego's self-image. The person who sees themselves as always kind represses their cruelty. The person who sees themselves as strong represses their neediness. The person who sees themselves as rational represses their emotionality. We become, in Jung's language, split. We develop a persona, a social mask, an acceptable face, and we exile everything that doesn't fit this mask into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil, though it contains everything we consider dark or unacceptable. It is simply the unlived life, the unfelt feelings, the unexpressed self. And here is where the trouble begins, because repression requires energy, constant energy. Freud compared it to holding a door closed against an intruder. You must maintain pressure on the door at all times. You can never relax. And the more powerful the intruder, the more intense the repressed feeling, the more energy you must use to keep it out. This is why people who are heavily defended, who have repressed large portions of their emotional lives, often seem so rigid, so controlled, so exhausted. They are spending enormous psychological energy holding themselves together, maintaining the walls that keep the unacceptable material out of consciousness. But energy is finite, and walls, no matter how strong, are never perfect. The repressed material finds ways to escape. Not directly, that would defeat the purpose of repression, but indirectly, through symptoms, through anxiety, through dreams, where the censorship of the ego is weakened and the unconscious can speak in symbols, through what Freud called the return of the repressed, those moments when the buried content erupts into consciousness, often in disguised form, catching the ego off guard. Let me give you an example from Freud's own casework. A young woman could not drink water. The mere sight of a glass brought on violent disgust. This had persisted for weeks. Under hypnosis, a memory surfaced. She had seen her governess, a woman she disliked, allow her dog to drink from a glass. The disgust she felt toward the governess, which she had repressed for social reasons, had been displaced onto the act of drinking itself. When she remembered the event and allowed herself to feel and express her disgust consciously, the symptom vanished. The energy that had been locked in maintaining the repression was released. The symptom, which was the voice of the repressed material trying to be heard, was no longer necessary. This is the pattern. Repression creates symptoms. Symptoms are compromises. They allow the repressed material a distorted expression while keeping its true nature hidden from consciousness. A person cannot acknowledge their rage, so instead they develop migraines. They cannot face their grief, so instead they feel nothing at all, a numbness that slowly spreads across their emotional life. They cannot admit their fear, so instead they become obsessively controlling, trying to manage every variable in their environment. The symptoms are both prison and message. They trap us in suffering while simultaneously trying to show us what we refuse to see. But Freud's work was only the beginning. As psychology evolved through the 20th century, other thinkers would add crucial insights to this picture. Carl Jung, Freud's most brilliant and rebellious student, would argue that repression wasn't just an individual phenomenon, but a collective one, that entire cultures repress certain potentials, certain aspects of human nature, that the shadow has not just a personal form, but a cultural form, and that when these collective shadows are not integrated, they erupt in social violence, scapegoating, war. Wilhelm Reich, another psychoanalytic pioneer, would observe how repression isn't just mental but physical, how it creates what he called character armor, chronic tensions in the musculature that mirror and reinforce psychological defenses. That trauma and repression are stored in the body itself, in the way we hold our shoulders, clench our jaws, restrict our breathing. Modern neuroscience would discover that traumatic memories are indeed stored differently than normal memories, often in the right hemisphere and limbic system, without the integration of language and narrative that allows them to be processed and released. That the nervous system can remain in states of chronic activation, producing anxiety and hypervigilance long after the original threat has passed. The attachment theorists, Bowlby, Ainsworth, and their descendants, would show how our early relationships create templates, internal working models, that shape how we repress and express emotion throughout life. That children who learn their emotions are too much for their caregivers to handle develop sophisticated systems of self-suppression, of emotional dampening, that persist into adulthood as anxiety disorders, depression, relationship problems. All of these thinkers, across different schools and decades, were mapping the same territory, the landscape of the split psyche, the architecture of internal exile, and what they all discovered was that repression, while initially protective, helping us survive situations we are too young or powerless to escape, eventually becomes the problem itself. The walls we build to keep ourselves safe become the walls of our prison. But here is what makes this story truly tragic. We don't just repress individual memories or feelings. We often repress entire parts of ourselves. Our creativity, if it was mocked. Our intelligence, if it threatened others. Our sexuality, if it was shamed. Our strength, if it was punished. Our vulnerability, if it was exploited. We perform in effect a kind of internal murder. We kill parts of ourselves so that other parts can survive. And then we wonder why we feel hollow, why we feel anxious, why we sense that something essential is missing from our lives but cannot name what it is. Jung had a term for this, the unlived life. He believed that the greatest burden a person can carry is an unlived life, not the life they failed to achieve externally, the career, the relationship, the success, but the life they failed to live internally, the self they refused to become, the feelings they refused to feel, the person they could have been if they had not been so afraid. And this unlived life doesn't stay quietly buried. It ferments, it sours, it transforms into the very anxiety and chaos we are now exploring. But how exactly does this transformation occur? How does buried emotion become present terror? How does repressed content create the specific feeling we call anxiety? That sense of impending danger, that racing heart, that catastrophic thinking, that feeling of being on the edge of dissolution? To understand this, we must now descend deeper. We must enter Act 2 of our journey, the descent into conflict, the heart of darkness, the place where repression meets its consequences. We must go into the chaos. There is a pressure building in the basement. You live on the upper floors, the floors of consciousness, of daily life, of the persona you present to the world. You are busy. You are functional. You have learned to manage. Perhaps you even consider yourself successful, together, capable. But beneath you, in the depths you have sealed off, something is changing. The repressed material is not static. It is not an inert collection of forgotten things. It is alive. It has weight. It has force. And it is constantly seeking expression, constantly pushing against the barriers you have erected, trying to return to consciousness. Freud described this as a kind of hydraulic system. Psychic energy, libido he called it, though he meant something broader than sexual energy, must go somewhere. It cannot simply be cancelled or wished away. When we repress a feeling, we are not eliminating it. We are rechanneling its energy, blocking its natural expression, creating internal pressure, and pressure always seeks release. This is where anxiety is born. Let me explain this carefully, because it is the key to everything. Anxiety is not random. It is not a chemical imbalance that appears from nowhere, though chemistry is certainly involved. It is not just genetic bad luck, though genetics play a role. Anxiety is a signal, a siren, an alarm system that has been tripped. But an alarm for what? For the approach of repressed content. Think of it this way. Repression works by keeping certain thoughts, feelings, memories out of consciousness. But these contents are always present in the unconscious, always exerting pressure to emerge. And when something in your present life resembles or triggers the repressed material, when you encounter a situation, a person, a feeling that is similar to what you've buried, your psyche goes on high alert. The alarm rings. Danger. The forbidden thing is approaching. We must keep it out. And what you experience consciously is not the repressed content itself, the defenses working after all, but the defenses activation. You experience the fear of the thing, not the thing itself. You feel anxiety, formless, objectless, free-floating anxiety, because your psyche is mobilizing all its resources to prevent something from becoming conscious. This is what Freud meant when he said that anxiety is transformed libido, transformed emotional energy. The energy that should be flowing naturally in connection with its original feeling or impulse instead becomes dammed up, distorted, experienced as dread. Let me give you a contemporary example that will make this tangible. Imagine a woman, let's call her Sarah, who grew up with a critical, controlling mother. As a child, Sarah learned that expressing anger toward her mother brought severe punishment and withdrawal of love. And so Sarah repressed her anger. She became instead the compliant daughter, the good girl, the one who never made trouble. This worked, after a fashion. Sarah survived her childhood. She even thrived in certain ways, excelling at school, avoiding conflict, maintaining the appearance of having it all together. But now Sarah is 35. She has a career, a marriage, a life that looks successful from the outside, and she is having panic attacks. They come out of nowhere, it seems. She'll be at work in a meeting, and suddenly her heart is racing. She can't breathe. She feels like she's dying. She goes to doctors. They find nothing wrong. They prescribe anti-anxiety medication. It helps somewhat, but the panic attacks continue. In therapy, a pattern emerges. The panic attacks always occur in situations that involve authority figures. Her boss, her mother-in-law, anyone who treats her the way her mother did, with criticism, control, disapproval. What is happening? Her repressed rage is being triggered. But Sarah cannot consciously access this rage. Her entire defensive structure is built around keeping it out of awareness, and so what she experiences instead is anxiety. The anxiety is the alarm system warning her. The rage is approaching. The forbidden feeling is near. We must stop it. But because Sarah doesn't understand this, because she experiences the anxiety as random, she begins to avoid any situation that might trigger it. She becomes smaller, more contained, more careful. She quits her job because her boss reminds her of her mother. She distances herself from her marriage because her husband occasionally expresses needs, which triggers her buried rage at being controlled. The anxiety, trying to protect her from one danger, the danger of feeling her own rage, creates a different danger, the progressive shrinking of her life. The chaos multiplies because the original problem remains unsolved, festering underground. This is the terrible irony of repression-based anxiety. The defense creates the very instability it is trying to prevent. And this pattern, this architecture, repeats in countless variations across millions of lives. Consider another form, the anxiety of the overachiever, the person who cannot stop working, cannot rest, whose mind races constantly with tasks and plans and worst-case scenarios. Beneath this driven anxiety often lies repressed vulnerability, repressed needs for rest and care that were forbidden in childhood. The message they received was, "Your worth depends on your productivity. Weakness is unacceptable." And so they repress their exhaustion, their need for connection, their very human limitations. But these needs don't disappear. They create pressure, and this pressure is experienced as anxiety, a constant sense that if they stop moving, if they let their guard down, something terrible will happen. The anxiety drives them forward, never allowing them to touch the tender, tired, needing self beneath the performance. Or consider the person who experiences chronic anxiety in relationships, who feels constantly on edge with their partner, waiting for rejection, expecting abandonment. Often this anxiety stems from repressed childhood experiences of actual abandonment or inconsistent care. The child could not afford to consciously acknowledge that their parents were unreliable, because children depend on their parents absolutely, and so the fear and rage were repressed. But in adult relationships, whenever intimacy deepens, the repressed material stirs, and the person experiences intense anxiety, not as memory, not as historical pain, but as present danger. They may sabotage relationships, push partners away, create the very abandonment they fear, all to manage the anxiety that is actually the echo of something much older. Do you see the mechanism? Do you see how elegant and terrible it is? Repression takes emotional content and exiles it from consciousness. But exile doesn't eliminate. It only delays, distorts, displaces. The exiled content continues to exist, continues to exert force, continues to seek expression. And when circumstances align, when something in the present resembles the repressed past, the repressed material surges toward consciousness, but the defensive system cannot allow this, cannot let the forbidden thing be known, and so it activates, floods the system with alarm signals, creates anxiety, which is nothing more than fear without an object, or fear whose true object is displaced, disguised, made unrecognizable. And the person, caught in this internal war they don't understand, experiences chaos, emotional chaos, the sense that they are losing control, breaking apart, going crazy. They cannot understand why they feel this way, because they cannot see the battlefield. They only feel the explosions. Now let's add another layer of complexity, because the picture gets worse before it gets better. Repression doesn't just create anxiety. It creates secondary symptoms, the symptoms that arise from trying to manage the anxiety itself. Remember, anxiety is deeply uncomfortable. It is the nervous system's alarm system screaming, and humans, like all animals, will do almost anything to escape pain. So what do we do when we feel anxiety we don't understand and cannot resolve? We develop coping mechanisms, ways to dampen the signal, ways to numb, avoid, control, escape. Some of these coping mechanisms are obvious: alcohol, drugs, endless scrolling, binge watching, workaholism, compulsive eating, shopping, sex. These are the ways we try to outrun the feeling, to create enough noise, enough distraction, enough alteration of consciousness that the anxiety cannot reach us. Other coping mechanisms are more subtle: perfectionism, intellectualization, people-pleasing, constant achievement. These are ways of creating an illusion of control. If I can just be perfect enough, smart enough, loved enough, successful enough, then the anxiety will stop. It never does. Because the anxiety isn't about present circumstances, it's about buried history. And some coping mechanisms are psychological: rationalization, projection, displacement. We create elaborate stories about why we're anxious, blaming external circumstances, other people, bad luck, anything to avoid looking inward at the real source. But here's what's crucial. These coping mechanisms often become more destructive than the original anxiety. The alcoholic trying to drown their anxiety destroys their health, their relationships, their life. The perfectionist trying to control their anxiety burns out, alienates others, can never rest. The people pleaser sacrifices themselves repeatedly, building resentment that eventually explodes or implodes. We are watching, in real time, the multiplication of chaos. One layer of repression, the original burial of uncomfortable material, creates anxiety. The anxiety creates coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms create new problems: addiction, burnout, damaged relationships, lost opportunities. These new problems create more anxiety, which requires more intense coping, which creates more problems. It is a spiral, a vortex, a self-reinforcing system of suffering. And the tragic irony is that every step away from the original pain takes us further from the only thing that could actually heal it, turning toward the buried material, allowing it into consciousness, feeling what we refuse to feel. But that path seems impossible, because what has been repressed is repressed for a reason. It felt too dangerous to face then, and the psyche assumes it remains too dangerous to face now. This is why Jung said that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. We choose the neurosis, the anxiety, the symptoms, the chaos, because it seems safer than the authentic pain we're avoiding. We would rather live in chronic low-grade torture than risk the acute agony of facing what we buried. Let me take you deeper into this mechanism by examining what modern neuroscience has revealed about trauma and memory. When something traumatic happens, and I mean traumatic in the broad sense, including not just dramatic events, but ongoing emotional injuries, the 1,000 cuts of a difficult childhood, the brain's memory system can become overwhelmed. Normally, experiences are processed through the hippocampus, which helps contextualize them as memories, events that happened in the past. They are given narrative structure, language, a place in the story of our lives. But when the emotional intensity is too high, or when we are too young to process it, or when the experience contradicts our core sense of safety, the hippocampus can't do its job. The experience gets stored differently, in fragments, in body sensations, in the amygdala, the fear center, without the calming context of, this is over, this is past. These fragmentary trauma memories remain active in the nervous system. They are not repressed in the psychoanalytic sense, hidden away by psychological defense, but they are not integrated either. They exist in a kind of limbo, firing at unpredictable moments, triggering emotional and physiological responses that don't match current circumstances. This is what flashbacks are in PTSD. But even without full PTSD, many people live with these unintegrated memories, creating constant background static, a nervous system that's always slightly activated, always scanning for danger, never fully able to relax. And this biological reality interacts with psychological repression in complex ways. We may have a traumatic memory that's fragmented and unprocessed, the neurological level, and then we may also defensively avoid thinking about it or connecting it to our current problems, the psychological level. So we have both biological and psychological mechanisms working together to keep painful material out of conscious integration. The result? A person who experiences chronic anxiety but has no idea it's connected to childhood events they barely remember. A person who has panic attacks that seem to come from nowhere because the trigger is not consciously recognized. It's a smell, a tone of voice, a quality of light that resembles the circumstances of the original trauma. This is emotional chaos in its purest form, overwhelming feelings that seem to have no cause, no meaning, no solution. The person becomes a mystery to themselves. And here is perhaps the darkest twist in this already dark story. The longer repression continues, the more powerful the repressed material becomes. Freud observed this. Jung elaborated it. Modern psychology confirms it. What we refuse to integrate doesn't weaken over time, it strengthens, it gains autonomy. It becomes, in Jung's term, a complex, a semi-independent cluster of thoughts, feelings, memories that operates according to its own logic, pursuing its own agenda, often at cross purposes with the conscious ego. Think of it as an internal saboteur, a part of yourself that you've exiled, that now works against you. You consciously want a loving relationship, but the repressed part that was hurt in past relationships sabotages intimacy. You consciously want career success, but the repressed part that's carrying forbidden ambition or guilt about outshining a parent undermines your efforts. You consciously want peace, but the repressed part that's still fighting old battles keeps you in a state of war. This is why Jung insisted that we must integrate the shadow, must reclaim the rejected parts of ourselves, not because integration is pleasant, it often isn't, but because the alternative is to be haunted, undermined, sabotaged by parts of ourselves we don't acknowledge. Let me share with you a case study that illustrates all of this, the full architecture of repression, anxiety, and chaos. A man, let's call him Michael, came to therapy in his early 40s, successful businessman, married with children. On paper, everything looked good. But Michael was suffering. He had developed severe health anxiety. He was convinced he was dying of cancer, heart disease, brain tumors. The diagnosis changed, but the conviction remained. He went to doctors constantly. Every test came back clear, but the anxiety only intensified. In therapy, Michael's history slowly emerged. His father had died suddenly of a heart attack when Michael was 12, but here's the key detail. Michael's mother, overwhelmed by her own grief, told Michael he had to be the man of the house now. He had to be strong, take care of his younger siblings, not cry, not be weak. And so Michael repressed his grief, repressed his fear, repressed his need to be taken care of, to be a child who had lost his father. He became instead the strong one, the capable one, the one who had it together. For 30 years this worked. Michael succeeded, achieved, provided, but he never processed his father's death, never mourned, never felt the terror of that sudden loss. And now, in his 40s, the age his father had been when he died, Michael's body was screaming. The repressed fear of death, the unprocessed grief, the buried terror of sudden loss, all of it was erupting as health anxiety. His psyche was trying to force him to face what he'd avoided, the vulnerability of being mortal, of being dependent, of potentially losing everything. The anxiety was both the problem and the attempted solution. It was forcing Michael to pay attention to death, to vulnerability, to his body, all the things he'd repressed. But because he didn't understand this, the attention took a distorted form. Instead of grieving his father and acknowledging his own mortality in a conscious, integrated way, he was stuck in a loop of anxious body scanning and catastrophic thinking. The chaos in his life had multiplied. He couldn't work effectively. His marriage was suffering. His children were confused and frightened by his constant health fears. And beneath it all was a 12-year-old boy who had never been allowed to cry for his father. This is what repression does over time. It doesn't create a stable suppression of painful material. It creates an unstable system, always on the verge of breakdown, requiring constant energy to maintain, generating symptoms and anxiety that steadily colonize more and more of life. Until finally, if we're lucky, something breaks. A crisis, a breakdown, a moment when the defenses can no longer hold. And this breakdown, paradoxically, is the beginning of healing. Because only when the repressed material finally surfaces, only when the walls finally crack and the buried thing emerges, can we actually deal with it. Can we feel what needs to be felt? Grieve what needs to be grieved. Rage where we need to rage. Acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged. This is the threshold we've reached in our journey. We've descended into the depths. We've seen the mechanism. We've witnessed the chaos. Now we must witness the awakening. We must see what happens when a human being finally turns toward what they've been fleeing. When they open the door, they've spent a lifetime keeping closed. When they allow the repressed material into consciousness, and in doing so, begin the process of integration. This is not easy. It is not comfortable. In some ways, it is the hardest thing a person can do. But it is also the only way through, the only path from chaos to coherence, from fragmentation to wholeness, from anxiety to peace. Let us proceed to the revelation. There comes a moment in every descent when you realize you cannot go back. The old strategies have failed, the defenses have cracked. The carefully constructed life, built on repression, on denial, on the fiction that you can exile parts of yourself and still remain whole, has revealed itself as unsustainable. You are standing at the bottom of the well, looking up at a small circle of sky, and you face a choice that is not really a choice, because one path leads only to greater suffering, while the other, though terrifying, leads towards something that might resemble freedom. The choice is this: continue fleeing the shadow, or turn and face it. What we're about to explore now is the single most important psychological process a human being can undertake, the process of integration, of reclaiming the exiled parts of the self, of allowing the repressed material to surface and be consciously processed, of transforming anxiety from a chronic condition into a messenger that can actually guide us toward wholeness. This is not self-help. This is not positive thinking or affirmations or 5 easy steps. This is deep work, the work of years, the work that requires courage most people don't know they possess until they have no other choice. So how does it begin? It begins with awareness, with the dawning recognition that the anxiety, the chaos, the symptoms are not random, that they are meaningful, that they are, in fact, communications from parts of yourself you have been ignoring. Remember Sarah, the woman with panic attacks triggered by authority figures? Her breakthrough came when she finally made the connection, when she recognized that the panic wasn't about her boss or her present life at all. It was about her mother, about the rage she'd been carrying for 30 years and never acknowledged. This recognition was not comfortable. In fact, it was excruciating, because to acknowledge her rage meant to acknowledge that her mother had harmed her, that her good childhood hadn't been entirely good, that she had legitimate grievances, legitimate pain. It meant dismantling the story she'd built about herself as the compliant, forgiving daughter who had no right to be angry. But here's what happened when she allowed this. The panic attacks began to subside. Not immediately. Healing is not instantaneous, but gradually, as she created space for her anger, as she let herself feel it in therapy, in her journal, in her body, The pressure that had been building underground began to release. The anxiety transformed. It became less about heart palpitations and more about conscious discomfort. She felt angry. She felt sad. She felt the grief of a childhood where her authentic emotions were unacceptable. These feelings were painful, but they were no longer chaotic. They had context. They had meaning. They could be processed. This is the pattern of integration. What was unconscious becomes conscious. What was fragmented becomes connected. What was experienced as anxiety, formless, terrifying, meaningless, becomes recognized as specific emotions that have specific causes and can be appropriately expressed and released. Jung described this process as making the unconscious conscious. He believed it was the central task of human development, particularly in the second half of life. We spend the first half building an ego, constructing a personality, achieving in the world. But eventually, if we're to become whole, we must turn inward and reclaim all that we left behind in the process. He called this process individuation, not individualism, not ego inflation, but becoming an individual in the deepest sense, becoming undivided. Integrating the persona with the shadow, bringing all aspects of the self into conscious relationship, and he was clear about the cost of not doing this work. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. But what does this work actually look like? How does a person begin to integrate what they've repressed? It begins with creating safety. This is crucial. Repression happened because the original material felt too dangerous to process. To undo repression, we need a context where it's safe enough to feel what was too frightening to feel before. This is why therapy can be so powerful, not because therapists have magic answers, but because they provide a relationship where difficult material can finally be explored. A trained therapist creates a space where you can look at what you've been avoiding without being overwhelmed by it, where you can feel your feelings without being abandoned or punished for having them, where you can dismantle your defenses gradually, carefully, with support. But safety doesn't only come from therapy. It can come from other healing relationships, friends who don't judge, partners who can hold space for difficulty, communities that acknowledge pain rather than demanding constant positivity. Once there's enough safety, the work of turning toward the repressed material can begin. This often starts with simply naming what has been nameless. Anxiety, as we've discussed, is often fear without an object, or with a displaced object. The work is to find the real object, to ask, what am I actually afraid of? What am I actually angry about? What am I actually grieving? These questions sound simple, but they're revolutionary, because they assume that the anxiety has a source, that it's not just brain chemistry gone wrong, but a meaningful signal that can be decoded. A person might sit with their anxiety and realize, I'm not actually afraid of public speaking. I'm afraid of being visible, of being seen and judged and rejected, which connects to an earlier time when being visible meant being hurt, when standing out meant being targeted. Or I'm not actually anxious about my health. I'm anxious about losing control, about dying, which connects to watching my parent die when I was young and being unable to stop it. The health anxiety is a displaced expression of that original helplessness. The process of naming creates coherence. It takes the fragmented, chaotic anxiety and gives it a history, a context, a meaning. And then comes the feeling. This is where the work gets hardest. Because naming is intellectual, and intellectual understanding alone doesn't heal. To integrate repressed material, we must actually feel it. We must allow ourselves to experience the emotions that were too big, too dangerous, too shameful to feel before. This is counterintuitive. Our instinct is to avoid pain. But the paradox of emotional healing is that the only way out is through. We must feel in order to heal. We must grieve to release grief. We must rage to release rage. We must tremble with fear to release fear. The body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk titled his groundbreaking book. Emotions are not just mental events, they are physiological processes. They want to move through us. When we repress them, we stop their movement, freeze them in our bodies, create chronic tension and activation. To release them, we must let them move. We must cry the tears that were forbidden, scream into pillows, shake and tremble as the nervous system discharges decades of held tension. Let our bodies express what our minds tried to suppress. This work often happens in stages. A person doesn't access 30 years of repressed grief all at once. That would be overwhelming. Instead, it comes in waves. A therapy session where old sadness surfaces. A moment alone where anger finally breaks through. A bodywork session where frozen fear begins to thaw. Each wave processes a piece of the buried material. Each wave is followed by a period of integration where the psyche adjusts to the new information, reorganizes around this more complete self-knowledge. And gradually, something shifts. The anxiety begins to lose its grip, not because anything external has changed, but because the internal pressure has been released. The repressed material that was creating the anxiety has been allowed into consciousness and processed. The psyche no longer needs to maintain the massive defensive effort to keep it out. People often describe this as feeling lighter, more spacious, like they can breathe more deeply, like a constant background hum of tension has finally quieted. But integration isn't just about reduction of symptoms, it's about reclaiming vitality. Remember, what we repress isn't only pain, it's also power, creativity, passion, depth. When we exile our rage, we also exile our strength. When we exile our grief, we also exile our capacity for joy. When we exile our fear, we also exile our capacity for courage. Jung observed that the shadow contains gold, that what we've rejected often includes our greatest potentials. The artist who repressed her creativity because it was discouraged. The leader who repressed his ambition because it was called selfish. The gentle soul who repressed her fierceness because it was called unladylike. As we integrate the shadow, we don't just become less anxious, we become more alive, more fully ourselves, more able to access the full range of human experience. Let me share a powerful example of this from Jung's own work. He wrote about a patient, a highly rational businessman, who began having dreams of a beautiful woman who danced and sang. Jung recognized this figure as an expression of the man's repressed feminine side, what Jung called the anima, his creativity, his emotionality, his aesthetic sensitivity. This man had built his entire life around logic, control, achievement. He'd become successful, but also rigid, anxious, unable to experience beauty or joy. As he worked with these dreams, as he allowed himself to engage with this repressed aspect, something remarkable happened. He began to paint, to listen to music, to feel emotions he'd cut off for decades. His anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed into creative energy. The pressure that had been producing symptoms found a legitimate outlet. This is what integration makes possible, not just the relief of suffering, but the reclamation of life itself. Now, I must be clear about something important. This process is not linear. It's not a steady climb from darkness to light. Healing moves in spirals, in cycles. You process one layer of repressed material, feel better for a while, then encounter a deeper layer. You integrate one aspect of your shadow, then discover another aspect you hadn't seen yet. This can be frustrating. People often think, I've already dealt with my childhood trauma. I've already processed my anger. Why am I still anxious? But the psyche is layered, like an onion, or like an archaeological dig where each level of excavation reveals an older, deeper stratum. We don't heal our entire history all at once. We heal what we're ready to heal, then live with that new integration until we're ready for the next layer. And sometimes the anxiety returns, not because the work has failed, but because new life circumstances are triggering material that hadn't been activated before. You process childhood wounds around your mother, but then you become a parent yourself and suddenly father wounds surface. You integrate repressed anger, but then you experience a new betrayal and discover grief you hadn't known was there. This is not regression. This is the ongoing work of being human. The psyche is always moving toward wholeness, always trying to integrate what's been split off. And life, in its wisdom, continues to provide opportunities for this integration, often in the form of challenges that feel like setbacks, but are actually invitations to go deeper. There's a concept in trauma therapy called post-traumatic growth, the observation that people who process their trauma don't just return to their baseline, they often emerge stronger, wiser, more compassionate than they were before. The suffering, once integrated, becomes a source of depth. The wounds, once healed, become sources of wisdom. This doesn't mean the trauma was good. It doesn't mean we should be grateful for suffering. But it does mean that suffering, when consciously processed rather than repressed, can be transformative. As Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." But I want to acknowledge something that's often missing from discussions of healing: the role of the body. We've been talking primarily about psychological processes, consciousness, integration, emotional processing. But as modern neuroscience and trauma therapy have shown us, you cannot heal the mind without involving the body. Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, demonstrated that trauma is stored in the nervous system as incomplete defensive responses. When a threat occurs, the body prepares to fight or flee. But if we can't do either, if we're too small, too powerless, if the threat is from someone we depend on, the mobilized energy gets stuck. It remains in the body as chronic tension, hypervigilance, anxiety. To release this, we must complete the defensive response. We must let the body finish what it couldn't finish then. This might mean literally shaking, allowing the trembling that was suppressed. It might mean movements of pushing away, of running, of defending, giving physical expression to the impulses that were frozen. This is why modalities like yoga, martial arts, dance, and somatic therapy can be so powerful for anxiety. They work with the body directly, allowing it to release held trauma without necessarily requiring verbal processing or conscious memory. The breath, too, is crucial. Notice how anxious people breathe, shallowly, in the chest, holding. This is the breath of someone in constant low-level fear. To shift out of chronic anxiety, we must literally change how we breathe, deeper, slower, into the belly. This signals to the nervous system that it's safe, that the threat is past. These may seem like simple techniques, but they're actually profound. They're ways of communicating directly with the ancient, pre-verbal parts of our brain that govern the anxiety response. You can understand your anxiety intellectually, can trace it back to childhood experiences, but if your nervous system is still locked in a defensive state, the anxiety will persist. True integration requires all levels: cognitive understanding, emotional processing, and somatic release. Let me now address what might be the most challenging aspect of this entire process: the relationship between integration and relationship. Many people pursue healing in isolation. They go to therapy, read self-help books, meditate, do inner work, and all of that is valuable. But there's a limit to how much healing can happen alone. Why? Because repression often began in relationship, in the disconnect between the authentic self and what was acceptable to caregivers, peers, culture. The wound is relational, and relational wounds require relational healing. This means that eventually the work of integration must extend into our actual relationships. We must practice expressing what we've repressed, not in explosive, unprocessed ways, but in conscious, boundaried ways. The person who repressed anger must learn to set boundaries, to say no, to express disagreement. The person who repressed vulnerability must learn to ask for help, to admit weakness, to show up imperfectly. The person who repressed their needs must learn to voice them, to expect them to matter, to choose relationships where they can be met. This is terrifying, because these are the very things that felt dangerous before. But here's the crucial difference: we're not children anymore. We're not dependent on specific people for survival. We have agency. We can choose relationships that can handle our full selves. And if we express authenticity and someone rejects us, that's information. They're not our people. Better to know. Authentic relationships. Relationships where we can show up whole, where repression isn't necessary, are the ultimate antidote to anxiety. Because anxiety, at its root, is often about disconnection from self and others. When we repress parts of ourselves, we can never be fully known, fully seen, fully loved. There's always a sense of fraudulence, of waiting for the other shoe to drop, of anxiety that our hidden parts will be discovered. But when we integrate our shadow, when we become conscious of and accepting toward all aspects of ourselves, we can show up authentically. And authentic connection, being seen and accepted as we actually are, is one of the most healing experiences available to humans. This doesn't mean oversharing or making every relationship a therapy session. It means gradually, carefully, learning to bring more of ourselves into connection, to trust that we can be imperfect, emotional, needy, angry, sad, all the things we learned weren't acceptable, and still be worthy of love. And here's the beautiful paradox. As we become less defended, less anxious, more whole, we become better partners, friends, parents, colleagues, because we're no longer projecting our shadow onto others, no longer using them to avoid our own material, no longer creating drama to distract from our internal chaos. Integration makes us more emotionally available, more present, more genuinely responsive to others, not because we're trying to be good, but because we're no longer split against ourselves. This is the promise of the work, not just personal peace, though that's no small thing, but the capacity for genuine connection, for love without constant fear, for relationships that don't replay old patterns but create new possibilities. Let us now turn to the final movement of this revelation. What does all of this mean for humanity as a whole? What does it mean that millions of people are walking around with massive unconscious material, creating individual and collective anxiety, driving behavior they don't understand? And what might become possible if we, as a species, began to take seriously the work of integration? We have journeyed together through the architecture of the split psyche. We've seen how repression begins as a survival mechanism, a way to manage overwhelming emotion in situations where we lack the power or support to process it. We've witnessed how this buried material transforms into anxiety and chaos, creating symptoms that multiply across a lifetime. And we've explored the path of integration, the difficult, necessary work of reclaiming what we've exiled, of becoming whole. But before we part, we must zoom out. We must look not just at individual psyches, but at the collective human condition. Because if individuals repress and create anxiety, so do cultures, so do societies, so does our species. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche deeper than personal experience, containing universal patterns and potentials. But he also spoke of the collective shadow, the aspects of humanity that we, as cultures and civilizations, refuse to acknowledge. Look at our world. Look at the anxiety epidemic, the rising rates of depression, addiction, suicide, the political polarization, the environmental destruction, the cycles of violence and trauma that repeat across generations, across nations, across centuries. These are not separate phenomena. They are symptoms of collective repression, of material that humanity has buried, but which continues to exert pressure, to create chaos, to demand integration. We have repressed our animality, our vulnerability, our interdependence with nature. We have built a civilization on the fiction of infinite growth, infinite control, infinite separation. And now the repressed is returning, in climate crisis, in pandemic, in the breakdown of systems we thought were stable. We have repressed our shadow collectively, projecting evil onto other nations, other races, other ideologies, rather than acknowledging the capacity for darkness within our own groups. And this projection creates the very conflicts we fear, the very chaos we're trying to avoid. What would integration look like at a collective level? It would mean acknowledging our history, the traumas, the injustices, the wounds we've inflicted and received, Not to wallow in guilt or victimhood, but to process, to grieve, to learn, to ensure these patterns don't repeat. It would mean recognizing our interdependence, that we are not separate individuals in competition, but interconnected beings whose well-being is inextricably linked. It would mean facing our fears of change, of loss, of the unknown future, rather than building ever more sophisticated systems of denial and control that only create more anxiety. This is the work ahead, not just for individuals in therapy, but for humanity as a species. We are being called, by the crises of our time, to become conscious, to integrate our shadows, to heal the splits that have created so much suffering. And here is the great hope. Integration is contagious. When one person does the work of becoming whole, it affects their relationships, their family, their community. Healing ripples outward. Consciousness spreads. You, listening now, are part of this process. By even being willing to look at these ideas, to sit with discomfort, to question your own defenses and repressions, you are participating in something larger than your individual healing. You are participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself. The descent into shadow is not a journey away from life. It is a journey toward more life, more vitality, more authenticity, more capacity for joy and connection and meaning. Yes, you will encounter pain there. Yes, you will have to feel what you've been avoiding, but you will also find your power, your creativity, your depth. All the life force you've been using to maintain repression becomes available for living when you no longer need the defense. So I leave you with this. What is waiting behind the door you've been afraid to open? What part of yourself have you exiled? What feeling have you forbidden? What truth have you been running from? The anxiety you feel is not your enemy. It is a messenger. It is your psyche's way of saying, something is trying to emerge. Something needs to be integrated. Pay attention. You can continue to run. You can continue to repress, to defend, to manage the anxiety with substances or distractions, or an exhausting maintenance of control. Many people do. They live their entire lives fleeing themselves. Or you can stop, turn around, face the shadow, open the door. It won't be easy, but it will be honest. And from honesty comes the possibility of wholeness. From wholeness comes peace. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of no longer being at war with yourself. The choice, as always, is yours. But know this, the door will keep calling, the repressed will keep pressing, the anxiety will keep speaking, because the psyche, in its wisdom, never stops trying to become whole. How much longer will you make it wait? Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. The descent is complete. The revelation has been offered. What you do with it begins now. Thank you for taking this journey into the depths. May you find the courage to continue it in your own life. May you discover that what you feared most about yourself is often what you need most. And may you remember, you are not broken. You are not defective. You are simply human, which means you are fragmented and whole, shadow and light, chaos and order, all at once. The work is not to eliminate the chaos. The work is to understand it, to integrate it, to transform it into consciousness, and in doing so to become, finally, fully alive.